River access laws vary from state to state. There are some states where you can fish and walk up to the high water mark, and some states where you cannot step foot in the water on private property. You also may have heard the word navigability, but do you know what it means and why it's so important? And where do you go for help if you have questions? Today we have one of the most knowledgeable river access all-stars in the country, and today he's going to break it all down so next time you are on the water, you know exactly where to stand and how to navigate private property. This is the Wet Fly Swing podcast, where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to give back the fish species we all love. Hey, how's it going? I'm Dave, host of the Wet Fly Swing podcast. I've been fly fishing since I was a little kid. I grew up around a little fly shop and have created one of the largest fly fishing podcasts in this country. I've also interviewed more of the greatest fly anglers than just about anyone out there. Beau Beasley, author of multiple fly fishing books, owner of the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival, and just all-around super guy. He's going to be breaking it down today. This is another passion of his, river access laws. You're going to learn about today and all the details around river access. You're going to hear about what you should do if you get challenged by a landowner while fishing near private property, and who to contact if you have other big questions while you're out there, and how this applies directly to your state. Plus, you're going to hear a bunch of great stories, and all of these stories are going to help you clearly understand how to navigate these river access laws and what you can do to make sure you are ready to go for your next trip. Beau always has a lot of energy, so it's great to have him back on the show. Here we go. Beau Beasley. You can catch him at beaubeasley.com. How you doing, Beau?
Good, Dave. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I think today it feels like every time we have you on, we're talking about a really important topic that I'm interested in. We recently had you on. We talked about Healing Waters, your book. This was back on Memorial Day. That was a pretty amazing episode there. And we had you on before, and you've got the festivals going and things like that. So today we're going to change it a little bit and talk about river access laws, because you're also an expert in that. So are you ready to jump in? Maybe before we jump into river access, just give us a little update. I think there was a change maybe on your events. Are you going to be still doing?
Yeah. So my next event is the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival, which is January 10th and 11th of next year, 2025. And that is going to be a Friday and a Saturday in Doswell, Virginia, which is about 20 miles north of Richmond. And this will be our 24th annual event. And to get more information about that and see a list of some of the speakers and vendors that we have updated so far, you can just go to www.va, which is the abbreviation for Virginia, vaflyfishingfestival.org. And, we'll have over 90 vendors this year. We'll have, guides and outfitters and lodges and all kinds of authors and instructors and, freshwater, saltwater, all kinds of instruction. And we also have 9 wineries and 3 distilleries. And admission is $20. And if you're over 21, we give you a tasting glass, and you can just wander around the festival grounds. And if you want to try some red wine or white wine, or you want to try some bourbon, if you're of age, then you can just kick back and have a glass of wine and sit through a class, or do whatever you want to do to enjoy yourself while you're learning more about the sport of fly fishing.
Nice. Perfect. And I was just there in Virginia for the first time, and it was really awesome. I love being there because of the history, driving around, the names of the universities, all the presidents in the past, and it's just got all this history.
Yeah, well, it's one of the original 13 colonies. So we've been around for a long time, and 8 of the presidents have come from Virginia, not the least of which was George Washington. So a lot of great history here for those that are interested in history.
Well, this is perfect because we're going to be talking about river access laws, and kind of first curious on the top, you being an expert in this. I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? Virginia, the laws, you're only 2 hours away from Washington, D.C., but maybe talk about that. How did you become an expert in river access laws?
Well, expert's kind of a loose term. Expert is somebody who's 50 miles away from home with a slide projector, as we used to say.
Right.
It's more a matter of I know a lot about the subject matter. And since there's not many people that do, you kind of joke, but in the land of the blind, the one-eyed troglodyte is king.
Right.
So it's not so much that I'm super smart as much as it is I just happen to bother to do the research because I had an angler who contacted me several years ago. He knew I was an outdoor writer, and one of his friends suggested that he reach out to me to get some help because he was being sued for fishing in what was advertised as public water. And that's how I got involved in the case. And it was a Jackson River case. And it was a landowner that owned a section of property that was part of a Crown grant. And he claimed to own the land under the river. And that may sound a little crazy, but he did. And he did. He went to court and proved it. I mean, we can get into that later on when we start talking about Crown grants, but most people are surprised to find out that people can actually own river bottom. You can own the land under the river. So if someone is trying or waiting on the river bottom and it is privately owned, then you are in fact trespassing. But these are all unique cases. There's not a one size fits all. And that's what makes it interesting and also challenging for people, because what might pertain in Virginia may not have anything similar in law in Louisiana or Texas compared to some state like Colorado. So, but you can own river bottom ownership. And it generally comes down to, it starts out by determining whether the river is navigable or not. And that term itself can be confusing. When I say that a certain river like the James River in Virginia, the lower part of the James, is navigable, what I mean by that is the river carries a federal navigational servitude, which means the surface of the river is controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. And the best way to understand this topic is I tell people you have to think about this subject is if we're in the colonial era. That's what would help you the most. So if you go back to thinking about the early 1800s, late 1700s, that's the perspective that we have. There are no major roads. There are no interstates. And the most common means of travel for commercial products, interstates in our country. And they carried commerce, and people just literally floated stuff down the river, whether it was hogs or horses or lumber or corn or tobacco or whatever. They just ferried it up and down the river to town, and that's how they got it there. And it became pretty common. And then people decided that they were going to start putting up their own private tolls. And Congress did not want to see that occur. You could imagine if you lived, we're making this up, if you lived in somewhere in West Virginia and you wanted to float something all the way down to Yorktown in Virginia, if every other farmer decided he was going to charge you a toll, by the time you got to where you were going, there'd be no money left. So in 1899, Congress passed the Rivers and Harbor Act, and Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, Congress gave the United States Army Corps of Engineers jurisdiction over what was a navigable river and what wasn't. So they are the ones that determine what a navigable river is. Now, then that brings up the point, well, what does navigable mean? In the sense that I mean, carrying a federal navigational servitude is just a fancy way of saying the federal government claims to own the surface. So just like an interstate, if you drive up and down Interstate 95 or Interstate 64 or whatever, or 81, whatever interstate is close to your house, anybody can drive up and down that road because it's public property. Now, in some instances, there might be a toll, but it's public property, just like a sidewalk. So anybody can be there. If it's deemed navigable, that river is subject to commercial traffic. and therefore the surface of the river is owned by the federal government. When the federal government claims to own the surface, in almost every case, the state then invokes the public trust doctrine and it claims to own the river bottom. So that's why that's a big deal. So if the river's navigable, the feds typically claim to own the surface, which means they regulate whatever commercial traffic happens there. That's why the Coast Guard can tell you, hey, if you're going to run a boat here and it's got a motorized engine, you have to have an Army Corps of Engineers captain's license.
Oh.
If it's a non-navigable river, then in most states, it can be privately owned. And if you own land on both sides, usually riparian landowners, which is just a fancy way of saying people that own land by a river or a creek, typically ownership defaults to the center of the river, or what's called the thread of the river. And if you have an area where a non-navigable river happens to exist, and the landowner owns on both sides of the river, then by default, he or she owns the bottom of the river. And you cannot stand on it. And in most cases, you can't even float a kayak on it.
Right.
So that's why people get confused when they, oh, well, that's a navigable river. What most people mean when they say navigable, they just mean you can float a kayak on it, or you can use it with a float tube or a drift boat. When I say navigable, that's not what I mean.
No.
That's why it gets confusing to people, because you use the same term to mean two different things.
Yeah. That is, I could see where, definitely it gets confusing, because navigable, yeah, you might think just if I can float a boat down, then it's navigable, but that's not it. But what about the other situation where I've heard this a lot in states where the water, people can own the bottom of the river, but the waters are public for everybody. They could float. You just can't anchor up. Is that something that is state by state, or is that not true?
That's also state by state. But typically, even if let's say you own the land under the water, you're quite right. You don't own the water. So the water is owned by the state.
Is that true for most states or all states?
Well, different states have different laws. Again, that's what makes it confusing. Now, what is interesting is, let's say, for the sake of argument, you have a private fishery and you stock the river with fish. It might be on your property, but technically, as soon as those fish enter the river, the fish become state property, believe it or not. Even if you bought them privately, the water and the fish that the water are in then become the possession of the state. But if you don't have access to them, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The other thing is, you can put 50 fish in a pool that they're not going to stay there. They're either going to go upstream or they're going to go downstream, or, there's a high water event and they get maneuvered around other places, or the water level goes down and they seek other places to summer over. So typically, navigable rivers are public. Once the Army Corps of Engineers says something's navigable, in almost every case, the state claims to own the bottom. Now, there are some exceptions. There was a case that I worked on that I wrote about along the Delaware River, and in this particular case, the Salmon River in New York.
Oh, yeah.
In this particular case, the Douglas and Salmon Run area, it was a navigable river, and it carried a federal navigable servitude. However, the state of New York sold their rights to a landowner.
Oh, wow.
And they continued to possess it. So here's where things can get touchy. I have people that contact me all the time on both sides of this issue. I have landowners that contact me fairly regularly, and I have anglers that contact me more, because they're trying to figure out, they're getting conflicting information about whether something is navigable or non-navigable, or whether they have the right to fish it or not. And people get very, very emotional. And what I try to explain to people is, the law has people kind of shake their heads and look at me like I'm crazy, or I got three eyes when I say this, but the law has absolutely nothing to do with what's right or wrong. The law has absolutely nothing to do with what is moral or immoral.
Right.
It's irrelevant. The only thing a court is interested in is what is legal and illegal.
Right.
That's it. So the fact that you feel strongly about Farmer Brown, quote unquote, privatizing your river or the state's river, in the eyes of the court determines whether it's privately owned or not, and how you feel about it is irrelevant. And I have these discussions both with landowners and anglers. And the thing that makes me a little unique is I don't take anybody's side, right? I'm an old school investigative outdoor writer, right? I'm an investigative conservation writer.
You're a journalist.
Correct. Or at least that's what I try.
Yeah.
And what I'm interested in is the truth. And if that makes you mad, I'm sorry about that. But that's just the way it is. And I'll have anglers call me up and this, that, and the other. And I'll go, well, nope, that's private property. And they'll get angry. Or I'll have a landowner contact me because I am known for being impartial. And they'll plead their case to me. And I'll go, well, send me your deed or whatever, and let me look into it. And then I go back to them and say, hey, I've looked into this and you got no case. I mean, now I'm not an attorney. I don't give legal advice. The only illegal advice I give people is if you're out somewhere fishing and you get challenged by a landowner or you get challenged by a law enforcement officer, particularly the law enforcement officer, you need to go ahead and comply with whatever they tell you to do. Because if you don't, then that, even if you're in the right, let's say you're 100% in the right, and the game warden, most of the times it's not a game warden. Most of the time it's a deputy.
Yeah.
Because you're in a rural area.
County, yeah.
Right. It's county law enforcement officers. And no offense, but they don't know anything about the law as it pertains to the river because they have, quite frankly, more important stuff to do, like dealing with rapes and murders and drug dealers and, that kind of thing. So mostly what I tell people is when you deal with a deputy, the deputies are going to do what the sheriffs want. And every sheriff in America wants the same thing, quiet.
Yeah. They don't want battles between landowners. Yeah.
Right. They just want, so the law enforcement officer that shows up just wants to diffuse the situation until you can get, better information.
Before we get started, let's hear from our sponsor. Waters West Fly Fishing Outfitters is your go-to resource for swung fly techniques, two-handed casting, and anadromous fish. Find out why Waters West has built a cult-like following around their fly tying materials and why they are the go-to resource for the OP and beyond. You can head over to wetflyswing.com/waterswest right now to check in with Ed and Kyle and get all geared up to get on the water. This year, I ventured into the heart of eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton territory where the fish were larger than life and the waters held the secrets of the best fly fishing out west. With crystal clear rivers like the Henry's Fork and the South Fork of the Snake and enough lakes to keep you going all year long, make your way to Yellowstone Teton territory and embark on a journey to one of North America's finest fly fishing destinations. It's time to experience eastern Idaho for yourself and support this podcast at the same time. Okay, and this makes sense. So first off, quick question. Where could people go for questions? Say they're in their state. There's 50 states, right? So where could they go to find out more information on what the navigability laws are in their state?
Well, the first thing they could do is try to contact their own local game office, right? I would call your natural resources department. Now, here's what most people are shocked to find out. Most states don't know what rivers they own.
Oh, right.
They have no like my state of Virginia, it does not possess a conclusive list of rivers that they say they own.
So how does that work? When you go to a river that they don't know, how would you figure it out?
It stays gray until it becomes a matter of public interest. And then if enough issues come up, then it gets resolved. Like this issue I was dealing with on the Jackson River, the state game department said that they had jurisdiction and that they owned it. However, and the angler kept going back, and the game department told them they could go. Well, the landowner tried to bring charges, criminal charges, and when the county attorney and the sheriff's office contacted the game department, they said, no, we claim to own the river bottom. Okay, well, you claim to own it. The landowner claims to own it. We're not going to get involved with a criminal case if there's not clarity. So we're not going to get involved.
Yeah.
So then the landowner sued the angler civilly. And then the angler went back to the game department and said, hey, now I'm being charged civilly. The game department told him it wasn't their problem.
Oh, wow.
That they only deal with criminal issues. They would not get involved in a civil case. And it went to court. It matriculated through the court system, took about 5 years. And in the end, the landowner, in this case, got what was called color of title. And basically what that means is the judge did not say the landowner owned it outright, but he said that he had a better claim of ownership than the angler. And basically it came down to the angler, the state of Virginia, and the landowner. The landowner claimed to own it and had a crown grant that preceded the state's possession. The angler never claimed to own the river bottom. He just claimed to be a guest of the state. And the state of Virginia did not show up at court to defend its ownership rights. So in lieu of that, the state gave color of title to the landowner. And, you know, some people got all up in arms about that. And they thought, well, since that happened, and let me back up. So I use the term crown grant or king's grant. Again, if we go back to colonial history, different people owned tracts of land, and crown grants or king's grant or a colonial grant that came from the government gave a person a certain amount of property. And it was not uncommon at all for those deeds to specifically state that not only do they own the land, but they owned all the game on the land. And they owned all the fish and fowl. And it's literally written in the deed.
Right.
So there's no question about did they intend to, to pass it on. So, and it went from one person to the next, to the next, to the next. Well, people got all upset and got angry. Oh my God, we fought the King of England and blah, blah,
right.
blah, blah, blah.
Right.
This is BS. Well, we were a colonial, we were a British colony. So whose laws, when we became a country, whose laws do you think we adopted? British common law. And British common law came with property rights.
Right.
And the deeds would pass from one person to the next, to the next, to the next. And this person's claim was, look, man, my claim goes all the way back to the original crown grant. Well, Virginia passed a law, I want to say 1802. And I used to have the code memorized. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but the bottom line was the state code said from 1802 onward that all subaqueous land not otherwise conveyed or owned by deed or special grant is now the property of the state. So basically what it says is all land underwater, subaqueous, all land underwater not otherwise conveyed or deed by special grant is now the state's. Well, that sounds great, except your law that you passed said unless otherwise conveyed. And my deed was otherwise conveyed. So don't get mad at me. You wrote the law. My deed preceded 1802. Now, you can't just wave your deed around, which I get all the time.
Oh, you do?
Oh, I have people tell me, I got a crown grant. And I ask them, usually it ceases with one question. I ask them, well, what king issued your crown grant? Well, they don't have any idea. It's just something that they heard. So in order for you to make an argument before the court in Virginia, you have to have a continuous chain of title from your deed of 2024 all the way back to prior to the 1800s.
Oh, wow.
That's no small thing.
No.
And if, let's say, as in the state of Virginia, whereas if you remember your Civil War, we had a little conflict here between 1861 and 1865.
That's right. That's right.
And a lot of courthouses got burned down.
Oh, no kidding.
So the deeds were lost.
Wow.
So if you have, let's say, for the sake of argument, you have your deed that goes from today back to 1865, and you've got deeds prior to 1861 back to the King of England, but you don't have the deed between 1861 and 1865, guess what?
Yep.
Your claim isn't any good.
Right.
You have to have a non-broken chain of title.
Yep.
And that costs a lot of money to research those deeds and go back and see, particularly when I took a picture recently of a marker, of a deed marker or language. You know, you see these historical markers, and I was fishing on the Potomac near Sharpsburg, and it talked about a particular deed of land deeded to some Indians. And the reason I took a picture of it was because the description of the boundary of the land literally said that the boundary went as far as you could shoot with an arrow 200 times.
Oh, wow. That is cool.
Okay. So 200 times. Well, think about that. What kind of bow?
Right.
It wasn't a compound bow, right? Was it made with an elm tree or made with an elk tree? You see, so those 200 lengths of arrow shots could be different lengths depending on what kind of bow you had.
Right.
So that's how the legality of things.
It's gray.
You know,
that's the law, right? The law is gray.
So it's gray. Attorneys love gray. Yep. That's attorney's favorite color besides green is gray, because if it's gray, then they're going to get paid to go in and argue a particular position.
Right.
And oftentimes deeds can be vague. And what you as a landowner have to do is to remove the ambiguity so you can argue your case. So let's say, using this case in Virginia on the Jackson River, that there are three landowners. And for the sake of argument, let's make them A, B, and C. Okay.
Yep.
A says he's got a Crown grant. B says he's got a Crown grant. C says he's got a Crown grant. And they're all shooing people off, quote unquote, their section of the river. But B actually goes to court and he makes his case or her case and he wins. Well, most anglers or outdoorsmen or access people start pulling their hair and screaming, oh my God, the whole river is going to be privatized now. No, just his deed got recognized by the court. And if you're landowner A or you're landowner B, you might have exactly the same documents, but you're going to have to go to court and prove it.
Mm.
So just because one thing happens doesn't automatically mean it's going to apply to anywhere else in the river. And that's where people often get,
fired up and confused. And
yeah, they get all upset and wrapped around the axles.
Right. And then it's even worse, right? It's even worse in this day and age because you have social media and stuff like that, which just adds fuel to the fire and it gets around quick and it might be the wrong thing.
Well, and so there's a couple of mistakes that most people make when they deal with access issues. And one of them is they automatically assume that whatever state they're from, that's the way it is everywhere else. That's the most common mistake.
Yep.
Number two, they just get some information off the internet. They see something on a message board and they think, oh, well, then that must be the way it is, right? The guy used really litigious words, use some big legal words, so he must be right, not necessarily true. And then number three, they read their information from an advocacy group. Well, advocacy groups are called advocacy groups because, wait for it, they advocate a certain position, right? And there's nothing wrong with advocacy groups. I am a longtime member of TU. I'm a huge TU fan. TU is not going to go to court to make sure somebody can mine somewhere because that's not their focus. They're not going to go to court to sue somebody to make sure that carp stay in the Mississippi. Why? Because that's not their mission. Their mission is cold water conservation. Well, advocacy groups are not going to go out of their way to do anything other than try to prove that they should have access to something, because that's what they do. But we shouldn't, you need to be circumspect in where you get your information from.
You got to do your own work, right? You got to do a little bit of your own work.
Right, before you go off, half-cocked. Now, if that doesn't make it even more complicated, a river can be both navigable and non-navigable at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And you're like, how is that possible? Well, if the river's 100 miles long and there was a history of commercial use, and usually courts make a determination on commercial use for a variety of reasons, but one of the most common is log drives.
Oh, yeah.
If they floated timber down to a sawmill, that's usually prima facie evidence that the court is going to say, okay, then absolutely, if you floated logs down, if there's a historical record of logs being floated down to, let's say, mile marker 50, from 0 to 50, they floated logs. Well, then that part of the river is going to be navigable. But guess what? If they pulled the logs out of the river at mile 50, because that's where the sawmill was, chances are from mile 51 to mile 100 is non-navigable.
Yep.
So it's navigable in one section and non-navigable in the other.
Yeah.
That's another reason that people can get confused and,
Yeah. And if it's designated navigable, again, going back to it, if it is designated navigable, that means that the federal government owns the water, and then usually the state will also own the bottom of the river.
Almost always. Almost always the public trust doctrine will kick in. And once that occurs, more or less the bottom of the river is kind of like a sidewalk.
Yeah.
Where anybody can be on.
Okay. And then what about, this is a little bit different of a situation, but I'm just curious because you hear a lot about it. Like Montana, I think, has these laws where it's just anybody can go anywhere. It's public up to the ordinary high water. And then you have Colorado, which is, I think, the different, where it's different.
Right. So those are two sides of opposite coins. Again, go back, think about the colonies. All of our states did not come about at one time. They came in dribs and drabs, and this state got added, and 3 years later, that state got added.
And then we picked up Alaska, right, for whatever, a small amount of money.
Correct. And we bought, a rather large section of the country. Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the country in 1 year when he bought Louisiana Purchase from France.
Yeah.
Okay, so some states are written into the state statute or into the state charter, like in Montana, all the riverbeds are owned by the state. It's just written that way. Now, in Colorado, the navigable rivers, they have not determined what rivers are navigable and what aren't. And that's what makes it difficult there. So in almost all of those cases, they can be private because there's only a couple of navigable rivers in the state. And since the state won't make a decision, then they can be privately owned.
Yeah, that's it.
So that's how it can be confusing. And then in my state of Virginia, or as in most states, about half the rivers are navigable, and then the smaller rivers are non-navigable. Now, where are you going to be absolutely safe? Well, you're going to be absolutely safe if you're in a state forest, or you're in a national forest or a national park.
Oh, right.
Or if it's a state park and there's a river there, then I guarantee you that's going to be owned by the state. If you are challenged, let's say you're Joe Blow and you're out fly fishing for smallmouth this summer and you get approached by a landowner and he or she insists that you have to leave, that it's private property, then it may well be. And I get this all the time. People, I've got a fishing license. Great. That means you have the right to fish. It doesn't mean you have the right to trespass. And we have to respect private property rights. Having said that, most states require you, if you're going to have private property, most states require that you post it. Some states don't. Some states don't even require you to post your property, but most people do. And but then you get in situations like where I got involved in a situation in New York on the Delaware River where a landowner's putting up signs that says he owns to the center of the river and he doesn't. But the sign says he does, even to the point that he uses New York's Department of Environmental Conservation's name on the sign.
Oh, wow.
To give it a veneer of legality when it's not.
Right. What happened with that one?
Well, the state of New York, I wrote an article about the Delaware, about Long Flats Pool, and a homeowner association there that said they own to the center of the river. This despite the fact that it's a navigable river. So going to have a hard case there. And I did research, talked to the landowner, got his perspective, drove to New York, went to the courthouse, pulled the deed, and found out that the deed stopped at the edge of the river and that the landowners had redrawn their property lines to the center of the river and filed it. Well, filing it in the court doesn't make it legal, right? You can say you own whatever you want. It doesn't make it legal. So the state of New York is taking comments right now, I believe, on how the state is going to act, not just in this case, but in other cases. But I know for a fact when I wrote that article about the Delaware that the phone was ringing off the hook with some of the state legislators up there, because I pointed out that, you know, there were people claiming to own parts of the river that they had no right, no right to do. And here's the way I feel about this. And I've made plenty of anglers angry too. I don't have a dog in the fight.
Right.
I just want to find out what's legal and what's not. It has nothing to do with, and people ask me, well, Beau, what do you feel about this? Well, how I feel is irrelevant. Who cares? I want to know what the law is. So if people are trespassing on private property, they quit doing it.
Yeah.
You don't have a right to trespass on private property. I don't care how you feel. Well, my grandfather and I, we've always done that. Well, you've always broken the law.
Right.
Conversely, if you're a private landowner, you can't just redraw your property line and appropriate half the river for yourself because you feel like it. And you've gotten away with it because nobody's challenged you and nobody's done the homework, quite frankly, and nobody's asking the state to do their job. So when people ask me, well, what if it's not clear? Then you need to go to your state game agency and get some clarity. And the reason I got involved in New York was because anglers had called up DEC and they claimed that they just got transferred from one person to the next and nobody would give them a straight answer. And sometimes that's not because of the agency's fault, although sometimes it's just bureaucracy and laziness. Sometimes it's because the state legislature hasn't made it clear enough for them to do their job. So in this case on the Delaware, I think what the state of New York is trying to do is provide some clarity. And if they don't, then the anglers need to contact their legislators. Same thing for the landowner. If you think you're being taken advantage of, call your state delegate. That's their job. So, and my other advice to people is, and I give them this advice all the time. Well, Beau, I got accosted by Farmer Brown and I called the game warden and the game warden told me I could go back and blah, blah, blah. But now, now the game department says they really don't know. Here's what you do. You write a letter. You write a letter to the head of the game department and don't be vague. Be very specific. I'm Joe Blow. I was fishing this section of the South River at this mile marker on this county, and this landowner approached me. Is it public property or not?
Yep.
And you put them on the spot. Now, I'm not saying don't be nasty, don't be angry, don't call up the game department cursing at them. Nothing positive is going to come out of that. And it could be an area that they legitimately don't know. But here's what will happen. The game commissioner in New York got called because somebody read fly fisherman and somebody said, okay, somebody explain to me why a retired fireman in Virginia is quoting New York game law to the Game Commission. Why is that? Why aren't we enforcing the law? And then people got involved. And it could be that the Game Commission needed direction from the state legislature. The game department they don't make up their own rules, right? It's like people get angry at the state trooper for writing them a ticket for speeding.
Right.
Writing the ticket, the court's going to determine whether you have to pay it or not. Go to court. So go to your state legislature, and once you write to the game department and they don't answer you, and 60 days go by, you write them again. And you say, hey, 60 days have gone by. I haven't gotten an answer. I haven't even got an acknowledgement that you got the letter. So where are we? And when nothing happens, then you go to your state legislator and you ask, dear Mr. Legislator, why do I need to buy a New York fishing license? And I'm not trying to pick on New York. It could be Virginia or the great state of North Carolina or Missouri or whatever. I'm not picking on New York. I'm not getting an answer from the game department. So what I'd like to know is, why do I need to buy a fishing license if I don't know where I can go? Somebody, well, that's the great thing about America. Everybody has a boss.
Yep.
So you go to and it could be that the game warden doesn't know. And I've had plenty of game wardens tell me stuff off the record. Beau, I think the landowner is wrong here or whatever, or I think the landowner's right here. And, I've had cases, I haven't written about it yet, but I've done research on a case in Georgia where, the head of the game department said that a river was navigable. And since he said it was navigable, he said he wasn't going to write tickets and people could go fishing there. Well, the only problem is there's nothing in Georgia state law that says the game commissioner or the head of the game department's law enforcement division can deem a river navigable. The only people that can do that is the Army Corps of Engineers or the Georgia state legislature. So people were trespassing because somebody felt like they could say something and make it legal, and they didn't. The exact opposite happened in something similar happened in New Mexico, where for years and years, people were prevented from fishing on public property because somebody in the game department wrote a regulation, which didn't have any bearing in the law. The guy just felt like it should have been done that way. So you just need to, be professional and be polite and ask for specifics. So if you have an issue and you can't get, the game department's not responding, and then you write your state legislator, and it takes time and effort, and people don't want to do that. And then if the state legislature, you just kind of get the runaround, well, then you contact an advocacy group, right? You write a letter to maybe the backcountry hunters and anglers.
Right.
Say, hey, all I'm asking for here is clarity. And you go from there.
Drifthook is your go-to resource for premium flies that will take your fly fishing to the next level this season. I had an unforgettable experience this year while on a Virginia spring creek. The fish weren't biting the standard patterns and couldn't get some of the big fish to take, even though we could see them perfectly. So I reached into my Drifthook fly box and pulled out a royal wolf. I tied it on, dropped that fly 20 feet above one of the biggest fish in the run that wouldn't take anything, and coasted it down to that fish. As I watched it come up towards the fly and slowly rose, it ate it. And that was a moment I'll never forget. Drifthook's flies and kits ship free. Plus, they have over 50 instructional videos and over 200 articles at drifthook.com. They are packed with resources and tools. You got to check it out now. That's Drifthook, Drifthook, and you swing at checkout for 15% off your next order. We recently had on Tom Bai, and he was talking about a similar, experience with just in journalism in general. He was researching this topic about, it was this really interesting case where this dad and daughter had this like illegal synthetic medical thing, but they also purchased the Deneki lodges, right? And they had this connection to fishing. But Tom spent 10 years on this story, right? And it eventually came out and things like that. And then he got sued for $250,000. And have you been in a similar situation have you been worried about that at all in your writings?
No, because I don't, I mean, I've had issues where editors or publishers, a magazine would run an article and then the publisher would threaten to fire the editor if they ever ran my work again
Oh, wow.
because they were afraid they were going to get sued.
Right.
But in my case, I'm very fact-based.
Yeah.
And I'm very impartial. And I'm not out to get anybody. I'm just trying to find out what the truth is. And most of the time, you know, one of the cool things that happened to me was I had a case in a particular state, 2 cases actually. And the angler called me, it was a guide, and he said, "Hey, I'm being harassed on this section of the river. And the last time I went down there, they called the deputy. I knew it was public water, but they called the deputies. The deputies, while I have a client with me, are threatening to arrest me if I don't leave.
Jeez.
You know, can you look into this?" So I did. And I wrote a letter. I didn't write a letter. I wrote an email to the district attorney, who is the chief law enforcement officer for each county. He's a district attorney. And I explained who I was. I explained the angler's position. I explained the deeds. I explained where the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, where their jurisdiction lied, where the game department jurisdiction laid, where the property lines were according to the tax office. When I was done, I never even had to write the article. I was just telling law enforcement ahead of time before I wrote it, because I'm, you know, being a retired police officer, being a retired firefighter, I'm very pro law enforcement. So I don't, if I'm writing about something that's super contentious, I typically give a heads up to the law enforcement people so they know about it ahead of time. So I wrote my email to the Commonwealth's attorney and laid out, you know, my bullets. Like 24 hours later, I got copied on an email to the sheriff, telling the sheriff not to harass anglers anymore in that section of the river. Furthermore, if the landowner continued to call and lodge complaints against the anglers, the district attorney was authorizing the sheriff to charge the landowner with harassing the anglers.
Right.
Or excuse me, false summons of police. So I never even had to write the article because, you know, and I spent a lot of time, it kind of ticked me off a little because I spent a lot of time on it, but it got resolved immediately because it was all fact-based.
Yeah.
And it's not emotional, and people can tend to get really emotional.
So you didn't write the article, so you didn't have to write it since you solved
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't have to write it. It got resolved.
Right.
Without me having to write about it. And I've had another case where a guide contacted me saying that he was being threatened with arrest by the Coast Guard for guiding without a United States Coast Guard license, a 6-pack license, which he said he was required to have. And the guide was very upset, called me, "Look, man, I got to feed my family. The next Coast Guard, you know, class in for like 6 weeks. And it's like $1,200. I can't not work." So I got the basic facts, again, found out exactly where he was on the river. And then I called the Coast Guard and I said, "I want to speak to your public information officer." And Chief Petty Officer, whoever it was, got on the phone and I explained who I was and what I was doing. And I said, "Here's the situation. And I'm going to write about this. I want the code. I want the legal code the guide is going to be charged with. Contact your special agent. I want to find out what he's going to be charged with if he doesn't have this licensure. P.S. That's not a navigable river, which means your agent doesn't have any authority."
Right. It's not navigable. Right.
Right. So he had no jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Well, about 48 hours later, I get a call back from the public information officer saying, "Yeah, this was a misunderstanding. This is all going to go away."
Right. Yeah.
And the guy didn't have to do anything.
Right.
Because he wasn't on a navigable river. He wasn't required to have, he wasn't even in a motorized boat. And again, I didn't have to write about that either. But it's because it's not based on Beau's opinion, right? If that's why I asked for the code that the guide was going to be charged under, you can't just charge somebody, "Well, you know, I don't like this guy. I like trout fishermen, and this guy fishes for smallmouth bass, so I'm gonna charge him. No, you have to charge him with something specific. Well, what happened was when that law enforcement officer went back to look for the code he was going to charge him in, he found out, oh, I don't have any jurisdiction here. And it all just went away.
You know what we need, Beau? We need to replicate you like 100 times so you can help people out all around the.
Well, I don't know about that. These cases can be very, very time consuming.
I mean, what happens when somebody? I'd imagine if somebody comes in, there must be a lot more people than you can write stories about, right? What are?
Yeah, I mean, I get. I'm sure I'll get a call or a couple of calls or emails after this interview because people go, hey, I've got that issue here at so-and-so or in this county or in that county. And I'm happy to say I've actually even had landowners contact me and say, hey, the state's trying to take my property away from me. And I think I own it. Will you help me? Right. I had a case, this was been a while ago in West Virginia, where I wrote about the Elk River and I helped a farmer keep his farm and prevented some development because I provided so much exposure. The water authority decided they didn't want the heat of being written about and it just went away. But I think, the problem with a lot of people is they don't want to put in the time to do it. And I'll tell you a dirty little secret. I could get all kinds of money. I could get printed all the time if I would demonize landowners.
Right.
But I'm not going to do that.
No.
But I'm not going to cover for them either. And probably the biggest compliment I've gotten is I've had a couple of people that disagreed with me or this or that. But they say, look, whether I like it or not, you bring the receipts, you do your homework, and there's not much else left to do. But these kinds of cases can be very, very time consuming, and they can be very expensive for me to do because I can't take an angler's word that day is light and night is dark because people lie to you.
Yeah.
And people don't want to hear that. Well, Joe Blow, I went down there and looked and it's clearly posted and I pulled the deed or whatever, and you got no business there.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Well, Beau, let's take it out here really quick with this is our 3 takeaways segment, and today it's presented by Fishhound Expeditions. We are heading up to the great state of Alaska, and we're doing an event up next year. We're going to be heading up there doing a road trip to meet up with some people. But Alaska, we haven't even talked about today, so we're not going to go into that. I'm guessing Alaska probably has maybe some strict regulations. I'm not sure what that looks like since it's such a huge state. But first off, maybe just you might have already said this, but 3 takeaways you've talked about today. If somebody's listening now and they want to really, they have some questions, you mentioned
sure.
is the first step.
The first takeaway is know the laws in your state. Do not assume that if you're going to a different state, that state's just like yours. Another takeaway is you cannot cross private property to get to public water. That's very established law, right? So if you like the James River is public water, but I cannot go across somebody's private backyard to get to the public water. You can only access it from, public launch sites.
Yep.
The other thing is, if you're unsure of an area, like I'm totally making this up, but let's say you're going to go to, I don't know, Illinois somewhere, and you're going to go to this particular county. You can call that game department and find out what game warden is there for that particular county. And you can say, hey, Mr. Game Warden, I'm going to be fishing on the Yazoo River in Illinois. Are there any access issues that I should know about? Is there any land there that, is any of that part of the river private? Nope, that's public property. Okay, then get his name, because here's another thing you can do. And I had this case in Pennsylvania where a guy came out, he was fishing in the Great Lakes below the water line, the high water mark. And the guy said, hey, you can't be out here. And he said, I most certainly can. No, you crossed my property. No, I didn't. I came down which is public property, and walked down and then entered this section of the lake. And I am in the shore. I have every right to be here. And the landowner got all angry and he said, well, I'm going to call the law. And the guide brought him up short by saying, well, go right ahead. And when you call, you make sure you dial 911 and you ask for game warden such and such, because
Nice.
he's the game warden for this area. And he'll be glad to inform you I have every legal right to be here. Now, ironically, that answer so impressed the landowner that he told the guide he was welcome to come back. And from now on, he could walk to his yard.
Right.
So it goes from being antagonistic to cooperative. Now, if you are an angler, you have some responsibilities of your own, right? Don't be tearing down people's fences. If you're in an area that's got some trash, pick it up, take it out with you. If you are on private property or you're on property that's shared, and you might want to consider asking the landowner, hey, would you like me to bring some fish back for you? Or, what have you. And we're seeing more and more of this where farmers are now leasing out their streams. I'm going to be fishing later this week with Tim Freeman of Cool Water Outfitters. And he has an arrangement with some Mennonite farmers. And he goes and looks after the stream and brings his clients there, which are it's all private water. And the farmers are thrilled because they get to make money off the river and somebody is watching the river for them and providing conservation overwatch. So it's win-win. And that's what we need. We need to try as much as we can. And TU stresses this, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers stresses this, Bonefish Tarpon Trust, same thing. We need to be as cooperative with landowners and government agencies as we can, and be more collaborative and less, adversarial.
Yeah, that's well said. And and we fished when we were in Virginia. We fished Mossy Creek, and I think that was a similar thing where they had a lease there to fish the private property.
Yeah, and I mean, Mossy Creek is a real. I mean, it's a Cinderella story where it's completely privately owned, but the landowners allow the public to come fish.
Oh, wow.
In large sections for nothing, or, some nominal fee like $5 on places like Beaver Creek, which is all private property, but they open it up to the public for, they collaborate with the Massanutten chapter of Trout Unlimited. And now, why does the farmer do that? Well, he's happy that the public's coming in. Massanutten TU is doing conservation work, improving the stream, which is also good for the farmer. And it's good for the public because you get to go to this great trout stream for $5. I mean, come on. So when people are operating collaboratively, you can get a lot more done. But you better believe that Massanutten chapter watches that stream, and they make sure there's no trash on it. And they're looking to do, to put in rocks or stream restorations or bank, preservation, and making sure trees are planted close to the river line to keep the water cool. So it's just a matter of being proactive and trying not to be antagonistic. But sometimes it happens, right? Sometimes people, for whatever reason, believe that they own something that they don't.
Or the opposite. We had an episode with Rare Waters, which is a company that's connecting, private landowners who have large sections of river with, people pay to play, essentially, right?
Correct.
A pretty reasonable amount. But we received a lot of hate mail on that episode because people were like, just didn't read into it. And they're like, oh my God, you're selling all of our public waterways, right? So do you hear some of that too, where people are confused?
No, but here's what I do hear. Oh, those rich blue-blooded bastards, those doctors and lawyers and blah, 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 evil rich people. And I always ask them, well, if it was owned by a bricklayer instead of an attorney, would he own it any less? If that section of stream was owned by a retired firefighter or a school teacher,
exactly,
would they own it any less than a brain surgeon? The difference between the brain surgeons and the attorneys is they have the money to defend their private property rights, and most of the rest of us don't. That's the difference. So one of the reasons I was the only person to ever get a personal interview, matter of fact, I got invited to his home and met his wife, and he showed me one of their old maps, land grant maps. I was the only person to ever get a personal interview with the landowner with the Jackson River case. And the reason was it took me 2 years before he would talk to me, but I remained impartial and advocated for his position, which I thought was probably legal. And because I was impartial, because I did not demonize him, he gave me information that other people didn't have access to.
Yep. Wow. Well, Beau, this has been great. I think we've covered a lot. I think the take home is everybody has to do their own research, and you got to basically do your due diligence, right? But if you think you're right, there's some people you can contact and follow
Absolutely.
up with. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if you think you have, a particularly interesting case, you can always send me an email through my website. I actually teach a class at the Virginia Fly Fishing and Wine Festival called Who Owns the River? And I explain these issues to people as best I can. And it's very rewarding when you finish your class and there's a guy waiting for you, and it's an off-duty game warden. And he goes, "That was exactly right." Or, you're a landowner or an angler that went, I never really thought of it that way before. That never occurred to me. So, we each just need to do the best we can and try to be cooperative, because we need these landowners' help. There's, about 40% of our wildlife either lives on or passes through private property. So we need to try to be as collaborative as we can. And, there are times where we're going to disagree. There are going to be times where, you can't collaborate, but we should try to collaborate where we can.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's basically, like you said, this country was founded on those principles of laws and being able to work together to solve some big things. So,
right. And the thing is, if we don't like the laws, we can change them.
Yep.
That's what makes America great,
Mm-hmm. We're not stuck.
Correct.
We're right. I had somebody tell me this recently. He was talking about how he was, from the United States, but he was fishing in Cuba, and he was talking to a guide in Cuba who was just saying like, "Hey, we aren't free here," and talking about how amazing the fact that the United States says any person in this country can do anything they want. Within the law, and they can call people.
Pretty much. And I'll tell you something else. You'll have people, some of the extreme environmental people, "Oh, it's great. The conservation rules in Cuba are great. Look how great the bone fishing is." Oh, that might be true. Go ahead and complain about the government and see what happens to you.
Oh, right.
Right?
Yeah. You don't want to do that.
Somebody comes and gets you at night and you don't see them again. So I think to whom much has been given, much is required. And we live in a great country, and we do have a legal system to work with. We just need to work within the parameters that we have and try to convince our fellow citizens to change a law in one way or the other, whether it be more conservation minded or more business minded. And we need to try to win over people to our position rather than, shame them into our position.
Right. Yeah. Awesome, Beau. Well, I appreciate all the information today. We'll send everybody, like we talked about, the Virginia Festival. It's coming up again, pretty much every January. Is it roughly
yes.
early?
Yeah. Usually the second weekend in January. This year it's January 10th and 11th. For the first time, we're going to do it on a Friday and Saturday instead of Saturday and Sunday. We're going to have a large women's program again, our Beyond the Cast Symposium, sponsored by Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation. And, we're pretty excited about it, and we're going to have a lot of fun. Tom Rosenbauer's coming back. We have some other exciting instructors coming back this year, so we're looking forward to having people. And this year we'll have 3 distilleries. So for those that may not like to have any wine, you can certainly try some bourbon. I know I will be.
Yeah. That's right. You guys have some good stuff there. Good. All right, Beau, we'll leave it there. And everybody, like we said, BeauBeasley.com as well. And thanks again for all the time today, Beau. And hopefully we'll get another one with you on in the future.
Great, Dave. Thanks so much. I enjoyed being on your show as always.
All right, the call to action today, know your state laws. Do your research. As Beau said, there's lots of resources out there. So take an hour, take a little time, call your local office if you have to, check in so you know where you stand out there. If you get a chance, please follow the show. That's the best way to assure you get the next episode delivered, and it also supports us along the way. Okay, we've got a number of big trips going on. One right now, the Alaska trip. If you want to find out more about this and see if we have any spots open for this is Alaska by road. We're going to be hitting this up next year, and it's going to be a great trip. So if you want to check in, send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com. And that's where I'm going to leave it today. I'm going to get out of here. We've got some great guests coming up here. We're going to be traveling outside of the country this year, and we're going to be heading to New Zealand and some other places around the world. So stay tuned for all those great episodes. I hope you have a great evening, a great morning, or a great afternoon, wherever you are, and I look forward to catching you on that next episode. Talk to you then.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.